Okay, guys, we're going to talk about Robert Louis Stevenson, who I really love. I think that he's just a fantastic writer with a good life story, and the piece that we're reading is such a magnificent piece in the sense that it has stood the test of time. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is still really relevant in our present day, 100-ish years later, not quite that much, but much later in time. So Robert Louis Stevenson was Scottish, born into a middle-class family. He was often sickly as a child and sickly as an adult. He grew up in Edinburgh, and as a student at Edinburgh University, he prowled through the seedier parts of Edinburgh, declared he was agnostic, and joined an organization called the Skeptics Club. So he was basically your college student who rejects all of his parents' values. Pretty classic. One of my favorite things about him is his understanding of literature and his belief about what literature should be. So he says that he believes that literature should capture not reality, it shouldn't capture reality, but it should capture life's deeper meanings and flesh out the underlying truths of the human condition. So he wasn't concerned about his stories being realistic, but having real themes at the heart of them. And you'll definitely see that in Jekyll and Hyde. So he's got a good story about his romance. He met his wife. Her name was Fanny Osborne. She was an American. He met her in France. She was married to someone else at the time. She went on to San Francisco. He followed her there, waited for her to get a divorce, and then married her. She was 10 years his senior and already had children. This was fairly scandalous, and for a time his parents decided they weren't going to give him money anymore when he was chasing off after this American woman. But eventually they decided, yes, they would give him a stipend to continue writing. They forgave him his mistakes. They continued to give him an allowance to write and to travel. One of the things he's most known for as a writer is that he really revitalized the short story, and helped make it an important part of English literature. His first popular tale was Treasure Island, published in 1881 in serial form, and then book form in 1883. And then Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was published in 1886 and was very popular immediately, and as I said, has stayed that way until the present. So one of the cool things about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is where the roots of it come from. So I'm going to give you this little story about Stevenson's life. So prior to even Stevenson being born in the late 1700s, there was this guy in England, actually in Edinburgh, named Deacon Brodie, and he was a cabinet maker. And he was a well-known, upstanding citizen in Edinburgh, and he made cabinets. And as part of his job making cabinets, he also fixed locks and repaired keys. So because he was this sort of like upstanding citizen in Edinburgh, all the wealthier people in Edinburgh employed him to like make furniture, make cabinets, to fix locks. And so he came in and out of like rich people's houses and got to know them, and like, again, was really well respected. Well, it turns out that he wasn't just making cabinets on the side, he was also breaking into these rich people's houses because he had keys to their house and knew how their like locks worked and had been in and out of their houses, and he was slowly robbing them. Eventually he got caught and got found out. Now this is relevant to Robert Louis Stevenson, even though it happened before he existed, before he was alive. It's relevant because Robert Louis Stevenson's father owned a cabinet that was made by Deacon Brodie. And so Robert Louis Stevenson was really familiar with this tale and was really interested in Deacon Brodie as a person and this whole double life. Matter of fact, he wrote a play that was not very successful called Deacon Brodie or Double Life, The Double Life. And this idea of Deacon Brodie and this sort of double life being both good and bad really stuck with him, and is really the seeds of where Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde came from. And that idea of this sort of double nature, this double existence, is really the primary theme of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Other themes to look for as you read that, though, look for the danger of tampering with nature. Look for this whole concept of duality. Is everything okay? Okay, so some additional themes about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that you might want to keep in mind as you read. First of all, the danger of tampering with nature, light and darkness, duality, does everyone have two sides? Male characters without families, where are the women in this story? Do readers identify with the villain of this tale? And then, why are people attracted to the villain in general? Is our current society less likely or more likely to generate Mr. Hydes? Um, how does religion play a role in this text, if you think it does? And then we never hear Hyde's voice as part of the literature. This is a sort of a critical, up for some debate. But Dr. Jekyll writes a letter at the end of the story kind of explaining his motives. And of course we hear from Mr. Utterson and we hear from Mr. Enfield, but we never really hear Mr. Hyde and his thoughts. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then one thing that I think is really fascinating about this piece is that the most feminine character is Mr. Hyde. I don't want to give too much away, but I would read for that if I were you, looking for elements of Mr. Hyde being feminine and what that might mean. That this is a story mostly about men and the villain is the most feminine character. Just things to consider. And finally, Hyde fears death. Jekyll does not. Jekyll fears exposure. He fears his reputation being ruined. And that's really what this story is about. The story is about protecting your reputation at any cost. So consider that. There's a lot more themes in your lecture notes, so look there. And enjoy Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's really a great piece. It's a little bit longer than some of the other things we've read, but it's fabulous. So enjoy.